Okay, I think we're all assembled, so without further ado I'm going to introduce Colin Humphreys, who's Professor of Material Sciences here in Cambridge. He has a huge list of honours which you can see in your handout, so I won't read it out. It just says Professor Humphreys has received numerous honours and awards, which is certainly true, and if I stood here it would take up most of his lecture time. But one anecdote I can perhaps remind you of, which I've heard him say before, which he published a paper on the date of the Crucifixion in Nature, the premier scientific journal, in 1983, yes, 83. And I remember him telling me, despite all these numerous awards, which are all for his science, it was, at least when he spoke, still his most highly cited paper. I don't know if that's still the case, but it was certainly extremely highly cited. And one thing scientists crave is high citation. So if you ask me, I can tell you exactly how many citations have been in my papers. So it obviously had a huge impact, and it was great to see a Christian publishing evidence for something which I'm sure a lot of the secular world has thought vaguely was some kind of myth or not really impacting on them. But there it was, right in the premier scientific journal in the world, and extremely highly referenced. So it's a real privilege, Colin, to have you come and talk to us today. I think you're going to perhaps update your 1983 work. It was only 23 years ago after all. So I'm not sure whether the date has changed or not. Colin, sure.
Well, thank you very much for that kind introduction, Bob. It's a great pleasure to be here. And this is, I think, it's a different sort of talk. I find it a fascinating topic, as you will see. One of the things which got me starting on this was when my father gave my daughter, who was aged about 8, a book, a small book. It was called Great Men of History. And I guess if it was being written today, it would be called Great Persons of History. Anyway, it's called Great Men of History. And it had 1 page per person. And in the front, it had a sort of index, and it listed every person in the book, and it gave their date of birth and their date of death. So Julius Caesar was there, born 100 BC, died 44 BC. Alexander the Great, born 356 BC, died 323 BC. And that was the same for every person in the book. And then Jesus was there, Jesus of Nazareth, and it said, born 4 BC, question mark, died AD 30, question mark. And so that really just struck me at the time that arguably Jesus had a greater impact on our world than any of these other people, and yet he alone apparently had an unknown date of birth and death. I mean, when you actually look into it, some of these other figures are a bit shaky as well, but by and large we do tend to know at least the date of death of some of the famous people in the world. So why are the dates of Jesus uncertain? I think the reason, very good reasons. Jesus was born a pauper. For example, when Jesus was presented in the temple, we're told that, or it's indicated that 2 pigeons were presented. And if you go back to the Old Testament, you find that the normal sacrifice for when a child is presented in a table is a lamb and a pigeon, but the Old Testament made provision for people who are not wealthy, who cannot afford a lamb. So the Old Testament makes provision for this, and for really poor people, they can present 2 pigeons or 2 doves. And that was done in the case of Jesus. So he was born a pauper, and people didn't record the births of pauper. And then he died a common criminal in the eyes of the Romans. So the Roman historians would not have recorded his death in the same way that they would have recorded the death of Julius Caesar. So there are good reasons for why the dates of Jesus are uncertain. Does it matter? Well, Bot already indicated that people have used this to cast some doubt on the historicity of Jesus. Last year I visited the site of the terrorist attack of 9/11, these great holes in the ground at the moment. And by the side of that is a very simple display, and the display was headed The Chronology of 9/11, and then were photographs and a blow-by-blow sort of account of what happened there. And so the Chronology of 9/11 just headed this display. And you'll know if you look at any history book, almost any history book, the chronology forms the framework of what's being discussed in that history book. So chronology is important. And if we know the date of the crucifixion, I think it does strengthen the historical basis of our beliefs and our faith. Not only that, if we know the date of crucifixion, it may be that this will help us to interpret some passages in the Bible which otherwise can be difficult to interpret because we're not setting them in their precise historical context. So let's start by looking at the broad range of dates which are possible for the crucifixion. All four Gospels, and also these extra-biblical sources, Josephus and Tacitus, tell us that Jesus died when Pilate was a procurator of Judea. And the Romans were very careful recording dates, and so Pilate's dates are known pretty well, beyond reasonable doubt, to be AD 26 to 36. And this is what Tacitus says. Tacitus says, their originator, Christ, had been executed in Tiberius' reign by the governor of Judea, Pontius Pilate. So that's when Pontius Pilate was procurator of Judea. So the crucifixion was in that date range. And that's also consistent with our knowledge of when Caiaphas was the high priest, and it's also consistent with our knowledge of when Tiberius reigned. So this broad date span, these three factors, Caiaphas, Tiberius, and Pontius Pilate, they all fit into this date range, of AD 26 to 36. What about the day of the crucifixion? Well, all four Gospels and early Christian literature are agreed that the day is Friday, despite some people who dispute this, and if you want to ask questions you can do afterwards, but the agreement is really that the day is Friday. And here's Mark, for example, writing, it was preparation day. And Mark adds, just because people might not know, that is the day before the Sabbath. That's when the crucifixion was. You know, the Jewish Sabbath was from Friday evening to Saturday evening, so Jewish days went from sunset to sunset. And so the day before the Sabbath was Thursday evening to Friday evening. The crucifixion was in the morning, so the crucifixion was on Friday morning. So the day of the crucifixion was Friday. And then the date of the crucifixion, and here we have a slight puzzle, which we'll come to in a moment. The date of the crucifixion was at Passover time, stated in all four Gospels, and there's a possible discrepancy of a day, which we'll come to, but the date of the crucifixion was either Nisan 14 or 15. Nisan was the first Jewish month of the year. It corresponded to our March or April, and Nisan 14 was when the Passover lambs were slain in the afternoon. Nisan 15, which going around from evening to evening, was when the Passover meal was eaten. The Passover meal was eaten at the evening start of the 15th day of the Jewish month of Nisan. So we've got three key clues dating the crucifixion. It was in this 10 or 11 year time period, AD 26 to 36. It was on a Friday, and it was either Nisan 14 or Nisan 15. So that enables us to formulate a rather precise question. That is, in what years did Nisan 14 or 15 fall on a Friday in this period, AD 26 to 36? Because if we can answer that question, this is going to eliminate some of these years as possible years for the crucifixion. It's going to throw up the years for the crucifixion which are possible. And Friday fell on either Nisan 14 or 15. The earliest reference I can find to the crucifixion was Tertullian. He was a Christian scholar, wrote in about AD 200, and he gave the date as the 25th of March, AD 29. We can reject that date because we can use astronomy to show that the Passover moon in AD 29 was in April and not in March. And so Tertullian was wrong, but Tertullian goes on to say, which is interesting, he says, this date, my date, is not accepted everywhere throughout the early church. So what we see from this is, by AD 200, the year of the crucifixion was being debated in the early church, and there was not an agreement, there was not a consensus. So they had difficulty in working back, as we shall see, to find out what the date of crucifixion was. Well, let's now home in and talk about Passover, because this is really quite critical. The Passover lambs in the 1st century AD were slaughtered between 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. on the 14th day of this first month, Nisan. Josephus explicitly tells us that. If you go back to the Old Testament book of Exodus, it says the Passover lambs were slain at twilight. The literal translation, I think, and I've got to be careful because Gordon Wren's a great expert here, literal translation is between the two evenings. Most people believe this phrase between the two evenings refers to the time period between sunset and the first stars appearing. This is known today as astronomical twilight. And there's some references in extra Old Testament literature defining this as twilight. So this is probably the meaning in the book of Exodus, between sunset and the first stars appearing. What happened by the time you got to the 1st century AD is that so many lambs had to be slaughtered that the time of their slaughter was brought forward because it couldn't extend into Nisan 15. It was brought forward into the early afternoon. And so Josephus explicitly says it was from between 3 p.m. to 5 p.m. So that's when the Passover lambs were slaughtered. The Passover meal then started at sunset that evening, and because the Jewish day ran from sunset to sunset, this was at the evening start in Nisan 15. And if you go to I think this is the play version of Fiddler on the Roof, which I mentioned there, there's a very nice scene where this Jewish family walks up to the top of their Jewish house, and a flat-top Jewish house, and they all watch, and they watch the sun go down and set. And then they turn around for 180 degrees and they watch the moon rise. And because it's the 15th of the month, it's a full moon, right? So the Jewish months, the first day of the Jewish month was defined as the first day you can see the faintly glowing lunar crescent in the sky. That's the first day. And since lunar months are 29 or 30 days long, then Nisan 15 is full moon time. So they would then eat their Passover meal outside in the light of the full moon. You can see very well by the light of the full moon, especially when you don't have these other lights around, so you get dark adapted very quickly. And full moon time, you can really see to walk around in the desert and not fall over things. It's a very powerful illumination. Well, now we come to a major problem. F.F. Bruce said this is the thorniest problem in the New Testament. And that is the date and nature of the Last Supper. And I'm not going to go into this in detail in this talk, because that would be another talk, but I'll just outline what the problem is and outline some possible solutions. This is what Mark's Gospel says. The disciples asked Jesus, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" Matthew, as you all know, says something very similar. Luke then records Jesus saying, as he's eating the Last Supper, "I have eagerly desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer." So there seems no doubt that Matthew, Mark and Luke say the Last Supper was a Passover meal eaten at Passover time. Now we know when Passover was in the 1st century AD, indeed in earlier times as well. It was at the evening start of Nisan 15. It was a long meal because people would ask their parents what happened at the Exodus. The Passover meal would start after sunset and end by midnight. It was a protracted meal, but that would be on Nisan 15. So, according to the Synoptics, Jesus and his disciples ate the Passover on Nisan 15 in the evening. Jesus was then arrested after that and crucified the next morning, which was still the same Jewish day, because the Jewish day goes from sunset to sunset. So according to Matthew, Mark and Luke, Jesus was crucified on Nisan 15. John appears to tell a very different story. When John introduces the Last Supper, he says it was just before the Passover feast, the evening meal was being served. And if you look at John's account of this evening meal, it clearly is the same meal as the Synoptics describe as the Last Supper. It is the last meal John describes, and it is the same meal as the Last Supper. John says it was just before the Passover feast. Later on, after Jesus' arrest, John says the Jews led Jesus from Caiaphas to the palace of the Roman governor. To avoid ceremonial uncleanness, the Jews did not enter the palace. They wanted to be able to eat the Passover. And John also indicates the crucifixion itself was before the Passover, because he describes the next day as being a high Sabbath, which was a term used when the normal weekly Sabbath corresponded with Passover. So John places the Last Supper, the trials of Jesus, and in fact also the crucifixion before the Passover. So John has the crucifixion on Nisan 14, with the Jewish Passover being being the following evening, which is Nissan 15. So this has been a great puzzle to people, and in a nutshell, these are the possible solutions. And I've looked at a lot of commentaries, right, and this is roughly in order of popularity, as it were. Most commentaries believe the synoptics are correct and that John is wrong. So basically most commentaries will say that the Last Supper was a real Passover meal. John, for theological reasons, dates the crucifixion as he does. And the argument here is that John previously, throughout his gospel, portrays Jesus as the Lamb of God. And so people believe, or some people believe, that this symbolism was so important for John that he deliberately placed the crucifixion on Nissan 14 when the Passover lambs are being slain, just to make this symbolism really clear. And so he distorted history, if you like, for the sake of this symbolism. And if that is correct, then the crucifixion is on Nissan 15 because that's where the Gospel places it. Another viewpoint is that synoptics are correct, but John can be interpreted to agree with the synoptics. And, well, how is that done? Very briefly, John 13:1 talks about the Passover feast. He says the evening meal was being served. He then goes on to describe the washing of Jesus washing the disciples' feet and then the eating of the meal. And some commentators say what John means by this is that the foot washing was before the Passover feast, and then they ate the Passover feast. So it's just before referred to the foot washing. If you read John, that's not the natural interpretation because he starts with the evening meal being served and then goes on to the foot washing. What about this piece of John? The argument here, you know, scholars you may know, Don Carson, for example, adopts this view, who's a very well-known person, both sides of the Atlantic. Don Carson adopts that view for John 13:1. John Carson says here that to eat the Passover refers to any of the meals in Passover week. So there was the Passover meal, but Passover essentially coincided with the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which is a 7-day feast. And so to eat the Passover referred to any of the meals in this week. And so our interpretation of John is sort of adjusted to fit the synoptics. It's not very convincing to my mind. The Greek used to eat the Passover in John is identical to the Greek used in the synoptics for Jesus eating the Last Supper Passover meal. And normally the Passover refers to this first Passover meal. It doesn't normally refer to the other feasts. So many of us will not like that interpretation, that John should distort history so much. This, I think, is trying to make John fit the synoptics, but it's a bit hard. Then this is another viewpoint that John is correct, but the synoptics don't really mean that this meal is a genuine Passover, but it's a Passover-like meal. So, for example, Bishop Tom Wright, Bishop of Durham, calls it a quasi-Passover. And this is quite a popular view. So the argument here is that Jesus knew about his impending arrest and death. He wanted to hold his Last Supper as a Passover meal, and he knew he wouldn't be able to do that because of his arrest and death. And so he held a Last Supper, which he designed to be just like a Passover meal, a Passover-like meal. People who support this idea point out that the Passover lamb is not mentioned in the account of the Last Supper, which seems to be quite powerful, except that it was just so well known at Passover you had a lamb that in a sense you wouldn't expect it to be mentioned necessarily. So that argument is not as strong as it might seem. But this is a popular interpretation, fairly popular interpretation, that this was not a real Passover, it was a quasi-Passover. And so if you accept that this is a quasi-Passover deliberately brought forward, then you can believe that John was correct and that the Last Supper was a Passover-like meal, and then the date of the crucifixion is John's date, which is Nissan 14. And then there's a final viewpoint, which is that both John and the synoptics are correct, but that they are using different calendars. And This view is probably supported by less than 1% of biblical scholars. It's the view which I actually think is the correct view. There's been only one theory which has received any attention among scholars, and this is a Catholic theologian called Annie Jobert, and she proposed that Jesus chose to use the Last Supper calendar of the Essenes. The Essenes had a different calendar from the official Jewish calendar, and in the Essene calendar, the Last Supper was always on a Tuesday evening. Right? The Essene year was 364 days, which is precisely divisible by 7, so it means that a given date always falls on the same day, right? A very convenient calendar. So, for us, December the 25th, as it were, in this calendar, would always be the same day, year after year. So the Essene calendar Passover was always on a Tuesday evening, and so Jobert argued that Jesus chose to have a genuine Passover according to the Essene calendar on a Tuesday evening, and that's the meal that synoptics describe according to that calendar. And then the crucifixion was later on the Friday of that week, and that's what John describes using the official calendar, saying that crucifixion was before the Passover. We've done some, a colleague and myself done some reconstruction of trying to reconstruct the Essene calendar, and we think this theory is wrong. I mean, theologians don't like the theory because Jesus, throughout the Gospels, shows no indication of using anything to do with the Essenes. So the Essenes really don't feature in the Gospel. So why should Jesus choose the Essene calendar for his Last Supper? What you can show calendrically, what I believe you can show calendrically, in fact, is that what Jobert assumes is that the Essene Passover, Tuesday, was before the official Passover. And what we've calculated is that in the years of the crucifixion, possible years of crucifixion, the Essene Passover was actually after the official Passover, which will totally rule this theory out. I've actually come up with another different calendar, which we won't go into on this talk, but this is, I just say it now, I actually believe that both John and Synoptics are correct, and that Jesus did use a different calendar. We know from the Dead Sea Scrolls there were many Jewish calendars in Jerusalem in the 1st century AD. It was a hotbed of conversation. It wasn't just the Essenes themselves had different calendars, not just one main calendar. So that's a different talk. But 4 possible interpretations. 2 of them put the crucifixion on Nisan 15, 2 on Nisan 14. So this is the problem we have to solve, which of the years AD 26 to 36 is Nisan 14 and or Nisan 15 on a Friday. And the modern church is still divided on this, and you can see this in the way they celebrate the Last Supper. So very crudely, about half the churches in the world use leavened bread for the bread of the Last Supper, and half use unleavened bread, right? Because if the Last Supper was a Passover meal, it would have been unleavened bread. And if it was before the Passover meal, it would have been leavened bread. And you still find that in the traditions of the churches of the world today. So, what we're going to do now is this is where the science comes in reconstructing the Jewish calendar in the 1st century AD. So, up to about the 4th century AD, the Jewish calendar was an observational calendar. The first day of the month was the evening when the crescent of the new moon was first visible. And the priests of the temple had a squad of people, about 40 people I think, who would go out, and 2 people had to say they'd seen the new moon. They'd be interrogated by the priests of the temple, and the first day of the month was when it was first visible. The mean time between new moons is 29.53 days, so that means each lunar month is actually 29 or 30 days long. No lunar months are 31 days long. People have been trying to calculate, I should say to start with, we have no historical records of the Jewish calendar from AD 26 to 36. For some other periods, just from writings, we do know some historical records of the calendars, because it's there in Jewish writings. But for this critical period, we have no records at all. So our only hope is to try and reconstruct this calendar using astronomy. People have been trying to do this for some time. The old calculations, which go back to several hundred years, would first of all, but basically, let me say, just as you can use the equations of motion of the moon around the Earth around the Sun, to calculate future calendars, you can also calculate back calendars, and the old calculations were to calculate when it was really a new moon called conjunction, when the moon and sun and earth were in line, and then to say you would first see the faintly growing presence of the new moon after about 30 hours after conjunction. But that's an approximation, and what Graham Waddington did, we discussed it with Graham Waddington, an astrophysicist who was at Oxford. He did really good calculations. So he calculated the brightness of the sky, night sky as seen from Jerusalem as the sun set and went below the horizon. Then he calculated the moon's surface brightness, taking into account the fact we've got mountains on the moon, which causes shadows, all these effects. And then the question is, you see the moon against the night sky when the contrast of this crescent moon is above the visual threshold. And we compared these calculations with many sightings, both modern and ancient, of the lunar crescent, and it fitted everyone, right? So these are really very, very powerful calculations, which I think we can have a lot of confidence. However, having done that calculation, there's then a further problem, which is known as the problem of intercalation. Intercalation refers to having leap years that we have now. We have to intercalate a day every so often. 12 lunar months total about 354 days, whereas one solar year is about 365 days. So there's a discrepancy between a solar year and a lunar year of about 11 days. That's a discrepancy every year. Now, in some ancient civilizations, they didn't care about this, and they used the lunar calendar. They just got more and more out of step with the solar year, and they didn't worry them. The Israelites, it did worry them, and they wanted to keep in step with the solar year for agricultural reasons, for the planting of crops, which of course follow the solar year, but particularly for religious reasons, because in the Old Testament, the book of Exodus, on Nisan 14, you choose lambs, which you're going to sacrifice. So the lambs have to be ready for Nisan 14, as it were. And then, even perhaps more marked, Nisan 16 was called the waving of the sheaf. It was when the first sheaf for barley was waved in the temple. And until that was done, the barley couldn't be harvested. So the barley had to be ready to be waved in the temple, right? So you had to have ears of barley there. But, you had to, it couldn't have gone too far, or else they'd lose their barley harvest. So it was critical that the lunar year was kept in step with the solar year. And so for this reason, the Jewish people intercalated to do this. And they had a particular rule, and what they did to intercalate, what we do for our leap years, we had an extra day every so often. The Jewish people had an extra month, and because one year was 11 days short of lunar year, 11 days less than the solar year, they would add an extra month, roughly 1 year every 3 years. And it was the Sanhedrin who did this, and they had a main criterion, and that was Passover had to fall after the spring equinox. And so they had, so if they saw Passover was going to fall before the spring equinox, they'd add an extra month. But they could also decree an extra month if the winter had been severe, because if they could see the crops weren't going to be ready, the lambs weren't going to be ready, they decreed an extra month. And we know this, and we have certain records of when this was done, but we have no records for AD 26 and 36. So the problem's a tricky one. We have no clinical records for this period at all, including intercalation. So what we did, what Graham Waddington, Graham Waddington is not a believer in this thing, which is quite interesting, so we had interesting conversations, and he's an expert astronomer. To start with, Graham Waddington determined when Nisan 14 fell on a Friday, from AD 26 to 36, taking into account this equinox rule. But then he recalculated everything, taking into account that the priests may have decreed an extra month. So he redid the calculations to take that into account. And then finally, he redid the calculations to take into account that the sky might have been cloudy, so you couldn't see the presence of the new moon, even though it was there. And we don't actually know what the Jewish people did in those circumstances. Because we don't know, we did these calculations. You can't get more than one day out of step because the Jewish people knew that months were either 29 days or 30 days long. So on the 29th day, the sky was cloudy, and then if it goes to the 30th day, if that was cloudy, they wouldn't have run any more because they knew it couldn't be more than 30 days. But what we tried to do in these calculations, we took every possibility into account. And these are the dates of the crucifixion, which emerged from those calculations. Nissan 14 fell on a Friday, on the 11th of April AD 27, 7th of April AD 30, 3rd of April AD 33. It fell, so that was when Nissan 14 was a Friday. Nissan 15 was a Friday, in 11th of April AD 27, 23rd April AD 34. If you're observant, you'll notice that 11th of April 27 is quoted twice, and that is because of this problem of cloudy sky and not knowing precisely when they would first have seen the crescent new moon to start with. So what might have been the first in Nissan was delayed by a day. This date, 23rd of April 1834, comes in if the winter had been exceptionally severe, so that's where that date appears from, and the priests have decreed an extra month in the year. So those are the dates we have. The source here, John's Gospel, is the Gospel which really says Nissan 14. Synoptics really say Nissan 15, unless they're using a different calendar, in which case it can be Nissan 14. So that's a range of dates we have for the date of crucifixion. And we would say there are not, other dates are not possible. Right? We would say other dates are not possible. So occasionally people will say AD 36 is the crucifixion date, and we'll say, no, it cannot be. Friday was not Nissan 14 or Nissan 15 in AD 36. So we'll say those are the possible dates, only those dates. Let's now look at some minor clues. Luke 3:1 very carefully tells us when John the Baptist starts his ministry. He says it was in the 15th year of Tiberius Caesar, and he tells us all other information as well. So he's very careful to point this out. The problem is, we do not know which calendar Luke was using by the 15th year of Tiberius. We do not know if he's using a Roman calendar or a Jewish calendar, and then in the Roman calendar there are two different ways of starting the reigns of kings. One's the actual date when they started, and another actually refers to the year in which they started in a rather complicated way. So this precise date of Luke is hard for us to interpret, but it's either AD 27 to 20, either AD 28 to 29, or AD 29 to 30. If we take the earliest possibility, then John the Baptist started his ministry in AD 28. So the crucifixion could not have been in AD 27 if John the Baptist started his ministry in AD 28 as the earliest date he could have done this. Paul's conversion is argued about, but the most probable date is AD 34. And AD 34 is only on this list, only on that list, if the winter was exceptionally severe, so the priests had said there should be an extra month. There was a lot of pressure on the priests not to do this unless they were absolutely sure, because if they did this and it wasn't a good decision, then people would have lost a lot of the barley harvest. So there's a lot of pressure for the priests to get things right. So we can rule out that date as being too early and that date as being too late. This was in fact the favourite date of Isaac Newton, who looked at this. And Isaac Newton also pointed out it was St. George's Day. Almost an additional reason. So when you look at these minor clues, it seems you can rule out AD 27 and AD 34. But you see, that's very interesting, because when you do that, you've actually ruled out the two possibilities in Nissan 15. So if you accept these minor clues, you say the crucifixion cannot have been on Nissan 15. It must have been on Nissan 14, and that date, the top date, is ruled out. So what we just have two possible dates for the crucifixion. And you see, we're now making some theological as it were, to come back to here, making some theological conclusions from these scientific calculations. We're actually saying that this is the most popular view, if you look at books that are written about this and the biblical commentaries, this most popular view that John distorted history is actually not borne out, because that saying 15 can't be true. And squeezing John to agree isn't true. So we're left with these as the two possible interpretations, that John is correct. The Last Supper was a Passover-like meal, or else two different calendars were used. So science has here been used to distinguish and help with biblical interpretations. So those are the possible dates. So that's just what I said. And people tend to say, look, John can't be right because John's the last gospel written, and the first gospel's written synoptics, and so they're more likely to be correct. Well, that argument's a very weak argument, because Paul says Christ our Passover is sacrificed, and he's clearly making an analogy with the killing of the Passover lambs. Josephus tells us the first Passover lambs were killed at 3 p.m. on December 14. Jesus died, according to the Gospels, at the 9th hour, which is measured from 6 o'clock in the morning. So Jesus died at 3 p.m. So there's this very precise analogy in John's chronology between Jesus dying at 3 p.m. on December 14 and Josephus telling us that the first Passover lambs were killed at 3 p.m. on December 14. Then Paul comes along and says, Christ our Passover is sacrificed. This clear analogy with Christ being the Passover lamb. And Paul's letter to the Corinthians, probably AD 55, probably written before any of the Gospels. So here's Paul agreeing with John and the sort of synoptics in the middle, as it were. And then there's another very interesting analogy that Paul makes. And that is, he describes Christ as the first fruits of those who rise from the dead. Now, this again, to the original readers, they will immediately have latched on to this phrase first fruits, because the first fruits were a Jewish festival, and there were a number of first fruit festivals, but the relevant one here, because at the right time, was this first fruits of barley, when the barley was raised in the temple, and the barley was raised in the temple on Nisan 16. So, if Christ was crucified on Nisan 14, John's chronology, Friday, he was raised on Nisan 16, the Sunday, and that fits Paul's analogy. Christ was raised on Nisan 16, the same day as the first fruits of barley are weighed in the temple. So the analogy fits. If Christ was crucified on Nisan 15, then the Sunday would have been Nisan 17, and so Paul would have been one day out in both of these analogies, which is unlikely, right? Because Paul was this tremendous intellect. So when he makes these analogies, then it makes no sense for one day out. So what we're saying is, Jesus was crucified on Nisan 14, when the Passover lambs were slain. He was raised on Nisan 16, at the same time as the first fruits of barley were weighed in the temple. So the analogies of Paul are exact there. If only if the crucifixion was on Nisan 14. We have, so we get this marvelous symbolism which comes in as well. There are two extra biblical accounts which specifically mention the days of the crucifixion. One is the apocryphal Gospel of Peter, which says Jesus' death was on the eve of Passover, which was in 14, and the other is the Babylonian Talmud, which says on the eve of Passover, Yeshu, earlier described as Yeshu the Nazarene. And most commentators believe this refers to Jesus, and this is specifically on the eve of Passover. So there's unanimity from the Gospels, if you interpret them in the right way, and from the extra biblical sources, the crucifixion was on Nisan 14, the eve of Passover. So these are the only then possible dates for the crucifixion, and it's interesting that biblical scholars who believe in a date for the crucifixion these are the most popular dates. So we're not saying anything out of the ordinary. The most popular date, if you go back maybe 100 or 200 years, was this 3rd of April 1833. Now, 7th of April 1830 is probably 2/3 of biblical scholars who believe in a date will go for AD 30, 1/3 go for AD 33. Can we say any more about this? Well, I think we can. What we said is the earliest date for the start of Jesus' ministry is the autumn of AD 28. The autumn comes in for the detailed analysis. So that's the earliest date when John the Baptist started his ministry, according to Luke chapter 3, verse 1, autumn AD 28. John's Gospel then records 3 Passovers in the ministry of Jesus, including this last one, at or around the crucifixion. So if John is right, and Luke is right there, that rules out AD 30 as being too early for the crucifixion. And then there's the temporal reference in John's Gospel, where the Jews say to Jesus, it has taken 46 years to build this temple, and if you use Josephus for when the temple building started, it went on 46 years, you get to AD 30 or 31, depending if there was a year's preparation time involved. So that, again, that AD 30 or 31 would then be the first year of Jesus' ministry, so it rules out AD 30 as a crucifixion year. I'm aware of some complications with the temporal reference, which we won't go into here, as I'm aware of them. So if we accept those two, then we're saying Friday, 7th of April AD 30 is too early for the crucifixion, and this is saying this is the date of the crucifixion, and that's the date which I believe all the evidence fits, even though, as I say, 2/3 of modern scholars will go for AD 30, but AD 33 is about 1/3. If you go back about 100 years, most scholars would have that as a date. I debated this. I was on Irish radio, that is relevant. I was on Irish radio debating this with a Catholic scholar, and the Catholic scholar was actually going for AD 36, and I was going for AD 33. And the guy who was the sort of chairman of this debate was a Catholic, and he was siding with this Catholic scholar, dreadfully, is most not an impartial chairman. And then he suddenly said to the Catholic scholar, he said, "What date does the Pope say?" And the Catholic scholar said, he says, 3rd of April, AD 33. And this chairman said, "That's what Humphreys says." And this man said, "Right." He said, "Well, you're a heretic," he said to this man. This is true, it's a traditional Catholic date. So, well, I think this date does help us to throw light on at least one curious gospel feature. And this is a puzzle which has puzzled some gospel commentators, that if you read the gospel accounts of the trials of Jesus and look at how Pilate is acting, he really seems to be a very weak character, right? Pilate, it is clear, believes that Jesus should not be crucified. Yet he's coming under pressure from the Jews, and he vacillates in what he does, and his wife has this dream, and Pilate's under a lot of pressure, but he comes across a rather weak, vacillating character, which is curious because if you read Josephus, then Pilate is a very strong character, who's strongly anti-Semitic as well. And Luke, in fact, earlier in Luke chapter 13, talks about the Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices. So there's this curiosity that Pilate, on one hand, is a very strong character, but then at the crucifixion seems to be a weak character. But if the crucifixion was in the 3rd of April AD 33, this explains that because Tiberius had Sejanus executed in AD 31 for sedition and for mistreating the Jews. And Sejanus was a person who directly appointed Pilate. So Pilate then lost his mentor, and Tiberius issued an edict to all the governors not to mistreat the Jews in AD 31. So there was Pilate, knowing that he was in a weak position politically, knowing that Tiberius has said, don't mistreat the Jews, and here he has a case of the Jewish Jesus, who shouldn't be executed, for the Jewish priests who want him executed. So you can understand this torment in Pilate's mind, and his weak stance at the trials, if the trials were after AD 31. So this date makes a lot of sense historically like that. So I think all the evidence we have fits this date for crucifixion. Right, I'm now going to very quickly talk about something which is controversial. And in a sense, what we've done is an elimination method. We've looked at various dates and said, this is too early, this is too late, hold on a date. We're now going to do something which is really controversial. And so in your mind, you should be very skeptical as I talk about this, because not many people accept this. And it hinges on Peter's Pentecost speech. And this is just part of his speech. I've condensed it. But this is Acts chapter 2:14. Pentecost, you know, was 7 weeks after Passover. So the events of the crucifixion and resurrection were very much in people's minds. This is what Peter says. This is what was spoken by the prophet Joel. In the last days, God says, I will pour out my spirit on all people. I will show wonders in the heavens above. I'm shortening this, as you can see. And then he says, the sun will be turned to darkness and the moon to blood, which I've underlined because what does it mean? Before that great and glorious day of the Lord shall come, and everyone who calls on the name of the Lord shall be saved. And the question is, what does the latter part of this statement mean? It's quite clear the initial part, pouring out the Spirit, occurred at Pentecost. What about the darkened sun and the moon turned to blood? And this speech, just to remind you, was just 7 weeks after crucifixion. The disciples have been speaking in strange tongues. They were accused of being drunk by the crowd. Peter has this wonderful reply. He says, they're not drunk, it's the third hour. It was only 9 o'clock in the morning. He would have said, today the pubs and the clubs aren't open. Well, he would have said that a few years ago before they were open at 9 o'clock in the morning. Third hour. They're not drunk, they're just very happy people. And they're filled with the Spirit. And then Peter starts this speech. He says, let me explain this to you. So what Peter is saying is saying, I'm going to tell you what has happened recently. Right? Let me explain this to you. This is what's happened recently. This is what's been happening. And the commentators are divided. A minority say that Peter is claiming that all the prophecy he quotes has recently been fulfilled. And F.F. Bruce is one of the people who says that. Most commentators say that the first part of the prophecy refers to recent events, the second part refers to the future. The argument against the part referring to the future is that Peter says, let me explain this to you, and why did he not stop the prophecy? Why didn't he not stop the part which referred to the future, if in fact he did refer to the future? Because the whole thrust of what Peter's saying is, this refers to recent events, the outpouring of the Spirit and so on. And he starts by saying, in the last days, and the last days is the phrase which refers to Christ's first coming. And we know this from, for example, Hebrews, which says, in the past God has sent prophets, but in these last days he sent his Son. The outpouring of the Spirit was Pentecost. If you make the interpretation that all the prophecies fulfilled, then the great and glorious day is a resurrection, because since that time, everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. Right? So that's how the quotation finishes with everyone who calls on the name of the Lord will be saved. That's what Peter is claiming. Since the resurrection, people who call on the name of the Lord will be saved. Then he goes on to preach about this, and people are indeed, as you know, converted at this talk. So let's just tentatively then follow this idea that all this prophecy has recently been fulfilled, and I think that is the natural interpretation of it. Well, if that's the case, then when Peter talks about the sun will be turned to darkness, then the obvious interpretation of that is the 3 hours of darkness you would call a crucifixion. If you want a natural event for that, then a natural event is a dust storm, which at that time of year are common. And there's a fairly obscure reference, I must say, in the Sibylline Oracles, which is an apocryphal book, which has a messianic section which says, let me get it right, it says, at midday dust came down from heaven to earth, and all the sky was darkened. So it's a rather interesting section, which appears to be a Messianic section, which appears to be saying there's a darkened sky specifically because the dust storm is specifically mentioned. So if you want a natural mechanism, that could be it. But in any case, the darkened sun, the 3 hours would refer to the darkness of the crucifixion, and then the moon turned to blood, which is quoted after the darkened sun, but before the great and glorious day of the Lord. This is an event which occurred between the crucifixion and the resurrection. So this is a very speculative interpretation. If you want to try and make it fit recent events, that's how you have to do it. Now what is interesting is there's 2 extra biblical reports. The first is an apocryphal book in the New Testament, report of Pilate, which says Jesus was delivered to him by Herod, Archelaus, Philippanus, Caiaphas, and all the people. At his crucifixion, the sun was darkened, people lighted lamps for 6 hours till evening, the moon appeared like blood. Now, most commentators believe this is a forgery. If it's not a forgery, then this is saying the moon appeared like blood at the crucifixion. If it is a forgery, then that is essentially saying there was a tradition that at the crucifixion the moon appeared like blood. If it's a Christian forgery, then there was a tradition, at least among some Christians, that the moon appeared like blood. And then this is a commentary on Joel by Cyril of Alexandria, who was Patriarch of Alexandria in AD 412. He was very orthodox, so this man is an orthodox bishop, and writing in his commentary on Joel, and writing the part of Joel that Peter quotes, he then talks about the crucifixion, and he says, there was indeed darkness at the crucifixion, and then he goes on to say, something unusual occurred about the circular rotation of the moon, so that it even seemed to be turned into blood. So what we have 3 documents which suggest the moon appeared like blood on the evening of the crucifixion. Acts can be interpreted in that way, and I agree, it's disputed. The report of Pilate explicitly says so, but we can't give it much weight. It's an apocryphal doctrine. It may be a forgery, but nevertheless, if it's a forgery, then there was this tradition. Cyril of Alexandria is an orthodox person, and he also makes this statement. So we have these 3 statements. So what does it mean? Well, if you're a scientist, then the moon being turned to blood, if you're a physical scientist, means a lunar eclipse. And one reason I'm late, I was trying to get a photograph to put on here, but there was I was also trying to look for cuttings from the Times, which had on the front page, I think about 3 years ago, and it actually said, the moon turned to blood over the UK. It actually used that phrase, it had this blood-red picture of an eclipsed moon. What happens is, at an eclipse, the moon is in the Earth's shadow. When the sun sets, the setting sun frequently looks red, and that's because the light from the sun is scattered by the atmosphere, and the blue end of the spectrum is scattered more than the red end of the spectrum, that's why the sky gets blue, and the light which travels from the sun towards the Earth, or the setting sun, goes through a long path length of the Earth's atmosphere, and that's why we see the red end of the spectrum when the sun appears red. Now, at a lunar eclipse, there's the sun over here, the Earth's over here, and the moon's over there, and the sun's light has to graze through a long path length of the Earth's atmosphere to hit the moon, so it's red light which hits the moon, and red light is reflected back to us, and that's why the moon appears red. It depends on atmospheric conditions. The moon sometimes appears black, but it frequently appears red. And so the eclipse moon can appear red, and in fact it is this blood red colour. And look for photographs, and you'll see it. If you go on the web, you'll see lots of pictures of a blood red moon as a lunar eclipse. Well, so scientifically, the moon turned to blood can mean a lunar eclipse. The key question is, outside of the Bible, where this phrase may be used for a lunar eclipse, did other ancient writers use this phrase, the moon turned to blood, to describe a lunar eclipse? Was it a known layman's way of talking about a lunar eclipse? Well, this is the first reference I could find. It's 331 BC, 20th September. Quintus Curtius, writing about the history of Alexander, he says, 2 days after Alexander crossed the Tigris, the moon was suffused with the colour of blood. Now, we know when Alexander crossed the Tigris. We can add on 2 days, and that's 20th September 331 BC. We do our astronomical calculations, lo and behold, lunar eclipse, right? So we know this reference, beyond reasonable doubt, there was a lunar eclipse that evening. This was the martyrdom of Bishop Felix. Again, it's recorded, the precise date is recorded, the 31st of August, 8304, and Acta Sanctorum says, when he was about to be martyred, the moon was turned to blood. The very same phrase is used in Peter's Pentecost speech. Do the calculations, it was a lunar eclipse that evening. And here's a third one. 2nd of March, AD 462. On March the 2nd, with the crowing of cocks after the setting of the sun, the full moon was turned to blood. And there are many references. These are just three. There are many references. And so it seems this was the standard term the ancient people used for a lunar eclipse, was the moon was turned to blood. I just put this in as an interesting aside. There was a lunar eclipse on 19th of March 1848, and there's this Forster writing. He says, the British consul in Ghent, who did not know there was an eclipse, wrote to me for an explanation of the blood-red colour of the moon at 9 o'clock. And so you can deduce from this that consuls 100 years ago knew as little about science as they know today. And there's a very famous story of Christopher Columbus' eclipse, which I really don't have time to tell you. So it's a wonderful story. He was shipwrecked, the crew were mutilated, the Indians who are bringing in food, in exchange for beads, the Indians realise they're in a rather powerful position, so they're stopping bringing food and demanding more and more and more. And well, I'm not telling a story now, but Columbus was actually sitting in prayer in his cabin, and finished praying, and he looked at his almanac, and he thought, there's going to be an eclipse tonight, from his almanac, right? And so he went up on deck, he called all the Indians, and he said, if you don't bring me food, then my God is going to be so angry, he'll cause the moon to be inflamed with wrath. This is what I use. It's recorded by his son, Ferdinand. And so the Indians apparently sort of laughed and went away. And then that evening, the moon appeared, blood red, and the Indians clamoured around the boat. And Christopher Columbus just sat in his cabin. He just sat in his cabin until they were really screaming, right? They're bringing food and all sorts of things. And he went upstairs and he said, now that you've given us this food, if you continue to do so, my God will look kindly and forgive you. And the moon became yellow. So, it's interesting that I haven't found a single commentary which says that this is a possible interpretation of the moon turned to blood. This is what F.F. Bruce says, who does adopt this broad interpretation. He says, it was little more than 7 weeks since the people in Jerusalem had indeed seen the sun turn into darkness during the early afternoon of our Lord's crucifixion. And on the same afternoon, the paschal full moon may well have appeared blood red in the sky in consequence of that preternatural gloom. Preternatural means supernatural. So he's taking this as literal and saying this is what he thinks happened. But again, because he didn't have the sort of scientific background, he didn't jump then to the conclusion which scientists or people who know about eclipses would jump to and say this is a possibility. Right. So let me just I must really hurry up. Almost there. We're almost there. So the question is, what about lunar eclipses visible from Jerusalem in this 10-year time period? Just as we can calculate future eclipses, so we can calculate past eclipses. As you go back in time, there's a problem, and that is the Earth's rate of rotation has changed. As you go back in time, partly it's tidal friction. I mean, the Earth is slowing up, right? One day it will stop, right? But tidal friction is causing a fairly uniform slowing of the Earth. So, and this is just, as you get the tides move around, and because of the attraction of the moon and the moon from the sun, the water causes a friction on the sandy shore beneath, and it's actually slowing up the Earth. So that's a uniform slowing up. And then the other effect is, which probably a great expert on, is that the polar ice caps keep melting and shrinking, and if you're a scientist, what happens is that's changing the moment of inertia of the Earth. So if the Earth has a constant angular momentum, which is something like I omega squared or something, if the moment of inertia changes, then the rate of rotation has to change. And we don't know how that's happened in the past. We can calculate the tidal friction bit of it, to calculate time of friction, these other non-periodic changes we can't calculate. So what we do is we use ancient Babylonian Chinese records that we trust to get information on how the Earth's rate of rotation has changed as you go back into time. And that's this was only came evident, it's been going on for about the last 20 or 30 years or so. So we do these very accurate calculations, and what you find is, in this period of time, AD 26 to 36, there was one and only one lunar eclipse at Passover time visible from Jerusalem. So it's just one, so we have a unique scientific solution. If this interpretation of ACTS is correct, then there is one and only one eclipse visible, and that's the data. So, which is quite remarkable. And so it agrees with the state determined. The other determination, totally independent, right? Totally different methods. So it does suggest this tentative interpretation of ACTS may be correct. And I think that's the final side. So I would claim that's the date for crucifixion. And we've got these interesting biblical interpretation issues which are involved as well. I'm sorry, I've been a bit longer. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Colin, for that magisterial account. Actually, I'll just tell one anecdote as chairman privilege on that rotation of the Earth thing. When the Earth was formed, the Earth was spinning about 4 times faster. It's been slowing down ever since. So one rotation took 5 to 6 hours. So I have a lot of debate with young Earth creationists. And when they say they insist that the Earth was formed in 6 24-hour periods, I say that's fine, but it would have to be 6 5-hour periods. Questions? I've seen them. Let's go over here in a minute.
Yeah, Colin, thank you very much for that talk. I seem to recall you writing at some point that Jesus being born with 5 BC?
Yes.
So what kind of age does that put Jesus at? It's not 33, but it's
No,
38.
no.
37.
About 37.
Right.
So that is a good question. I think there are only 2 references, I believe, to the age of Jesus in the Gospels. One is Luke's Gospel, where Luke says Jesus was about 30 when he started his ministry. And I'm told, going by Greek scholars, that this really is an imprecise, the about 30 is an imprecise date. So, and it's rather interesting that Luke precisely says when John the Baptist started his ministry, but he says Jesus about 30. The other reference is the Jews say to Jesus, "You are not yet 50." Right. So those are the only 2. And again, that's but anyway, that's what they say. And that may have some theological significance because at the age of 50, there's certain things happened in Jewish traditions. Yeah. So those are only 2 references we have. So if we take, and I'm told that Luke's about 30, is imprecise. So it could mean anything between 25 to 35. It's that sort of imprecise. So if we take that, and if we say that Jesus was born in 5 BC, and if you realise that there's no year 0 in historic reckoning, so you go straight from 1 BC to AD 1, right? And then if Jesus started his ministry, if Jesus was crucified in AD 33, and he started if you say his ministry was about 3.5 years long, which I think is the most likely, then he started his ministry in about AD 29. So John the Baptist would have started his ministry about AD 28, say. Jesus started his ministry about AD 29. Then if you go from AD 29 to about 5 BC, realising there's no year 0, then about 30 is okay. If you interpret it rather broadly.
Thank you.
I don't know if it's William Barclay who said regarding the difference between the Synoptics and John, that the Synoptics he felt kept very precisely to the date of Nicene 14 and 15, whereas I think he said that, I'm not sure if it was Barclay now, but that in the temple in Jerusalem, they weren't so precise. They wanted it on the same day of the week. And so therefore it would vary, it wouldn't vary in Jerusalem, but it would vary with those out in the countryside who were far more precise about this. But, it was just one viewpoint.
This is the date of Passover.
Yes.
Yes, yeah. I mean, I think all all the information we have, I think, is that the Jews of the temple were very precise about, having the slaughtering of lambs on Nisan 14 and then the Passover meal on Nisan 15. So I think the official Jews were, did guard that, and I think the information we have is in Jerusalem and elsewhere. But we do know from the Dead Sea Scrolls, as I mentioned, there are a number of different calendars in existence, and a key issue is whether the priests of the temple would have allowed lambs to be slaughtered on a different day from Nisan 14 in the temple, because the lambs are slaughtered by the people. And, I mean, if you go back to the original Exodus, of course, it was a household celebration. And no temple, but the lambs were slaughtered by the people, and blood was collected by the priests. And there's an interesting exchange. Well, I'm not sure what the source is. An interesting earliest document, which in fact David Inston Brewer at Tyndale House has done some work on, which is a conversation between two rabbis, where it's quite clear that lambs were slaughtered on Nisan 13, and there's this argument as to whether it should be allowed, but almost certainly that refers to one of these different calendars. So people in different calendars are having their Passover on Nisan 13, and two rabbis are debating whether they will allow them to slaughter their lambs in the temple. So it's quite a complex issue, but this paper of David Inston Brewer, I think, isn't yet published. I've got a preprint, so it's really very up-to-date sort of work.
What about that view that there were two Sabbaths on that week? That explains why there were different accounts in Luke and John.
Well, I think, there's a normal weekly Sabbath, and then the normal weekly Sabbath, right? And then then the Leviticus tells us that the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread was a holy day on which no work should be done, and that became known as the Sabbath of the Passover. And there was in fact then a dispute. I don't want to get complicated. There was a dispute between the Sadducees and the Pharisees, and whereas the Sadducees and the Pharisees seemed to celebrate Passover on the same day, they celebrated Pentecost on different days because they interpreted this passage in Leviticus differently. So I think Pentecost in Leviticus, I believe, all right, I'm now searching into my memory bank. Pentecost in Leviticus, I think, is strictly 50 days after Nisan 16, or the waving of the sheaf, and the Sadducees and Pharisees calculating different days. But sorry, let's come back to your question. So the first day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, which was the day on which the Passover meal was eaten, because the Passover meal was the first meal in the Feast of the 7 days of Unleavened Bread, that day was a day of rest and no work, Sabbath of the Passover. And when the weekly Sabbath coincided with that, which it did from time to time, and it still does now, roughly one day, 1 in 7, then that would be a special Sabbath. And so that's what most commentators believe when John refers to that Sabbath being a high Sabbath or a special Sabbath, because the weekly Sabbath coincides with this first day of unleavened bread, when the Passover meal is. Sorry, I haven't been too clear on that.
Then, how good is the 34 AD date for the conversion of Paul? And is it worrisome that the 33 date for the crucifixion is pushing uncomfortably close to the conversion of Paul, or is that not worrisome?
Okay, no, that is a good question. The 34 date of St. Paul, I skimmed over it a bit. People will debate that, and so the date of conversion of Paul is debated. One of the best books, I think, on this, of the date of conversion, is a book by Jewett or Jowett, where he looks at all the evidence for Paul and looks at all the interacting evidence and so on. But he reckons AD 34, and I find that quite convincing. But Paul's chronology is a difficulty. So I think that, combined with the unlikelihood of the priests actually decreeing that year, I think those two bits combined sort of mean you can rule out AD before, but I agree, it is somewhat questionable.
But actually, however, whether it's 34 or 36, it shows the Christian faith really spread like wildfire, doesn't it? He was going around persecuting them.
Yeah, it was almost as though he could have been there at the crucifixion.
Yeah.
Yeah, who knows?
I mean, if it is AD 34, it's probably towards the autumn, I think most people, I think that's what True comes out. So you have got 18 months in before the crucifixion and the conversion of Paul, which is quite tight, but nevertheless it's believable.
Yeah, it's not been out before, isn't it? Any more questions? Yes, Brent.
I was incredibly excited when I came across your paper years ago.
Right.
But you speak as if our leading New Testament scholars, such as Tom Wright, remain unpersuaded. Is that right? You imply that he does not accept 33?
Tom, I'm not sure if Tom has a date. So what you find is most New Testament scholars will not have a date, but they will decide on this 14 or 15.
Right.
Because something I had to think through and their training and everything. And so Tom, who I greatly admire, his writing is just a hugely prolific writer. I mean, he favours the Synoptic Gospels. I mean, I should say there's no. There's no obvious divide between evangelicals and liberals, Protestants and Catholics, right? So you find that evangelicals, some will believe synoptics, some will believe John, as it were. Same with liberals, so there's this split all the way. But Tom Wright favours synoptics and copes with John by. Sorry, am I getting it right? No, sorry, I'm getting it wrong. Tom Wright favours John, right? Favours John and copes with the synoptics by saying it's a quasi-Passover. So the synoptics of Jesus deliberately brought forward a Passover meal. It wasn't a real Passover meal. It's a quasi-Passover.
But that's consistent with what you just said there.
And that's consistent with my chronology. So it is consistent with this chronology. That's right. Yes.
Could you clarify one point? You said likely the ministry of Jesus would have begun shortly after John's ministry in AD 28.
Yes.
Is that correct? Because then it seems, although there are 3 Passovers in John, that only counts for 2 years and maybe a bit on each side.
Yes.
That's quite a stretch to reach AD 33.
Yes. So no, you're quite right. So John explicitly mentions 3 Passovers, and if that's correct, then the ministry would have been for 2 years or 2.5 years. But many people believe he omitted a Passover. And if you go through John, you can almost see where this may have happened. If that's the case, then it's 3 or 3.5 years. But I think it's hard to draw a definite conclusion. I mean, the arguments for 2 years or 3 years are quite finely balanced.
Well, even if it is 3 years, it's still stretching a bit to get from 28 to 33.
Oh, well, no, okay. Well, what I should have said was the earliest possible. I mean, the interpretation of Luke isn't straightforward because you don't know if Luke was when he talks about the this 15th year of Tiberius, whether he's using the Roman calendar or Jewish calendar, and then there are variants there. So the earliest possible date is AD 28 for the start of John the Baptist's ministry, but it could have been AD 29.
Any more questions? Any more before we let Bill come in? We'll let Bill speak.
I'm just curious, this may be common knowledge to everyone in this room except me. What in the world is the Babylonian Talmud? Does everybody know about this?
Babylonian Talmud.
Yes. This is the first I've heard of it.
Ah, right.
They didn't teach me that in neurobiology.
Okay. It's well, I mean, I have seen the document and it's there. I mean, but Gordon, maybe you can.
Yes, it's the standard collection of Jewish laws based on all the reminiscences of the rabbis that was compiled about AD 500. Especially, it's like an encyclopedia, so I'm not quite sure it's 8 or 10 volumes, but that's the sort of length of thing it is.
Right. So it's somewhat later than the Talmud.
The Babylon, no.
The Babylon is.
When people talk about the Talmud, they mean the Babylonian
the
Talmud.
Talmud.
There was another Talmud from Palestine, it's a bit earlier and a bit shorter.
Right.
The Talmud.
Right.
It was a commentary on the Mishnah, which was
Yes.
3rd century, and
Right.
that was from in Palestine. It was probably written, and then there were 2 Talmuds that were written in commentary on it, which was called the Gemara and that would have been the Babylonian one and the Palestinian one.
Right.
But collectively, the Mishnah and the Talmud are often called Talmud.
Right.
So-
That's very helpful. Thank you.
Good, I think that would be a good moment to pause. Are you staying tonight for the panel, Colin?
Yes, I'm happy.
Yep,
to.
so put questions in here as they come to you. We'll now take a brief, as the Americans would call it, our cousins in America would call it a comfort break. Brits would say time for a breather. Fresh air. And we'll restart at 25 past, do you want 5 minutes or 10 minutes, half past sharp?
5 minutes.
We'll restart in 5 minutes, then we'll have a chance to have dinner in time with John Bryan. So thank you very much again, Colin.